Hi there and welcome back to my channel. My name is Marianne, and in this video, I'll be showing you how to create realistic landscape paintings that look like photos, but still maintain a soft, painterly look. Let's get started by prepping our canvas. Prepping your canvas with a toned layer of primer is such a great shortcut to achieving better realism. Not only will the color allow you to read your values better, it will also add a subtle warmth to your entire painting, and sanding this layer once it's dried will allow your brushes to glide. I like to repeat this process at least twice before painting the edges black and adding in the drawing. I've also written 2 ebooks on acrylic and oil painting that you can download for free, and both cover canvas prep in detail. I've linked them in the description below. Another easy way to achieve realism in your work is to limit your palette. For this piece, I'll be using titanium white, burnt umber, ultramarine blue, quinacridone violet, and cadmium yellow deep. Limiting your palette guarantees harmony within the painting, almost like creating a custom color DNA that runs through the entire piece. Let's talk more about color as I start to add in the background, which is a combination of titanium white, burnt umber, and ultramarine blue with a smidgen of the violet to warm it up. Just so you can see what I'm working with, I'm going to share my reference photo on the screen. You can probably already tell that my painting's background is much more blue compared to the reference. This is a deliberate choice that I'm making because the coolness of the blues are going to pop the yellows of the train. This is where paintings can become far more expressive and interpretive than photos. But the adjustment I'm making doesn't actually harm the realism of the piece, and I'm going to explain why. I recently bought Richard Schmid's book, Alla Prima II, and one of the things I've been enjoying is his focus on values and rendering. Let's talk first about value while I add in the trees, as it applies to them directly. Value is how light or dark a color is, and Richard Schmid argues that getting accurate values is more important than getting the right color in terms of creating realism. This means that as the artist, I can play with my colors, such as making the background in trees more blue, but I still need to get the values right in order for it to feel real. Even though this background and the trees are all just shades of blue, it's still effective because of the values, and a lot of what you're seeing is very subtle. The trees and train cars further back have less contrast and appear mistier than the trees and trains in the foreground, which are darker and thus appear closer. This is a very important landscape painting trick. The further away something is, the more it fades, both in contrast, color, and detail, while objects that are closer have more detail, more contrast, and more color. Now let's talk about rendering. Rendering is the process of refining your details within a painting, so when you have a piece that has been significantly rendered, it's going to have a much sharper, more defined appearance than a painting that has been loosely applied. Let's go back to Richard Schmid. He makes the compelling argument that true mastery comes from identifying the most important brushstrokes and only applying those. That means that when you're looking at a painting like this, you're not going to try and replicate every single branch on the trees or every single detail on the train cars, but instead squint your eyes and try to recreate only the most important parts while suggesting the rest through loose strokes. This helps the painting feel atmospheric and soft, while again still maintaining the realism. When I was first starting out as an artist, I used to feel like I was cheating by not including every single detail of a reference photo in my final painting. But the longer I paint, the more I recognize the wisdom of being selective. Just because the camera captures every single detail of a reference doesn't mean I have to as well. If anything, you can create greater depth and movement in a painting through strategic looseness, since that more closely mimics what the human eye would see instead of a photo. So as the artist, don't worry about trying to render every single detail or include every piece of information you see in a reference photo, particularly if it doesn't add anything special to the painting. It's also okay if your lines are a little wobbly, because mine are too, and it's part of the painterly look. But make sure that they aren't overly sharp or crisp. Instead, soften those background lines by gently blending them just enough to take the edge off, which again contributes to a feeling of soft depth and realism. If you're working on a landscape that includes writing somewhere, such as on a sign or in my case on the side of this train, a trick that I use is to try and forget that I'm reading letters and instead only see lines. I also don't try to make them perfect and keep my edges soft, because I know from experience that a viewer's brain will do the work for me and will make sense of the lettering even when I don't render them to sharp perfection. That's fortunately just how the brain works, and it's how we can still read words even if they're written in an unfamiliar font. You may have also noticed that as we move into the foreground, I've started to increase the value range on the train as it gets closer to the viewer. That means that my darks are getting darker and my lights are getting lighter. To mix my darks, I'm using ultramarine blue and burnt umber with only a smidgen of white to keep it soft. Pure white or pure black should be used sparingly in paintings, and it's important to note that cameras often turn shadows into a flat black blob due to exposure settings. However, in real life, shadows are rich, multidimensional, and full of color. Adding the snowy mist at the bottom of the train is probably my favorite part and is surprisingly easy. All you need to do is take an old fluffy brush, dip it in some snow-colored paint, and gently swirl it in. You don't want too much paint for this, and instead keep your brush as dry as possible, which is how you create soft, feathered edges both in mist, snow, and clouds. Let's get started on the front of the train, which will use everything that we've discussed in the video so far. First, let's add a smidgen of the violet to the blues reflected in the windshield, which I'm doing because purple is complementary to yellow. Remember, as long as we get the values right, we can experiment with the colors. So I can take some artistic license and work in some violet as a complement to the yellow, which winds up accentuating both colors. Because this section is closest to the viewer, we can definitely do more rendering here, but to keep things painterly, don't go overboard. For me, that means sculpting this section with highlights, mids, and darks to create dimension, but I'm not bothering to hide my brush strokes, and I soften the edges on all my lines. Earlier in the video, I said to use pure white and black sparingly, but direct light sources are exactly where we need that pure white. This is the lightest value in the entire painting and will pull the viewer's eye straight to the front of the train, exactly where we want it to go. We're going to come back to the headlights because I have a few tricks to help them look like they're glowing, but first let's finish up all the rendering. Just like before when we added in the text, I'm not worried about getting all the lettering perfect. Instead, I'm focusing on getting accurate values and correct placement, which means I can let go of my perfectionism and not obsess over making each letter or number perfect. Before I moved on to the snowplow attached to the front, I realized I needed to take my own advice about not using black and lighten some of the blacks on the windshield. When I stepped back and squinted at the painting, I found it was too dark and tugging on my eyes. This is what I call a visual sticky spot, which is when a certain area of a painting is pulling on my eyes, and not in a good way. Trust your gut. If you come across a sticky spot and something just feels wrong, it's worth the time and effort to puzzle it out. Sometimes fixing a sticky spot can make the difference between a good painting and a great one. When you're working from a photo that has a lot of detail in one section but can be difficult to decipher, I find it's helpful to focus on forms that you see instead of trying to paint something specific. What I mean by that is, in my reference, this plow has a lot of information, but the painting distills it down to its simplest forms, which are chunks of snow, maybe a few lines here and there, and that's all. So whether you're working on a forest or a building or any kind of object in a landscape that has tons of little details, try to picture instead how it would look if you simplified it into the most basic of forms. If you need to add more detail, it's easy to layer on top, but you may find that just the forms themselves are enough to do the job. For the cherry on top, here's how I like to make my light sources look like they're glowing. All you need to do is add a halo of pale yellow all the way around the headlight and softly blend it out. Adding a golden ring or line around pure white is a surefire way to create the illusion of light, and feathering it out makes it feel like it's glowing softly. We'll also add a little more shadow nearby for contrast before adding in a few final details. And there you have it, the final painting. Thank you so much for watching, and please let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget to download my free ebooks, and I wish you great success with your paintings. Keep making your life beautiful, and I'll see you in the next video.